That's the thing, is we are now living with wolves. It's not wolves are over there and people are over here. People are now being asked to live right there alongside these animals in more and more areas of the West. And so people who care about those predators and who care about their future need to be in a relationship with those communities and asking how they can help.
All right, from Montana State University Extension and Western Landowners Alliance, this is Working Wild University, a show where we explore places where people and wildlife share the landscape. And we come with you from the crossroads of culture and science. I'm Jared Beaver, and today we're taking a look at wolves in California. This is a topic that's been in the national headlines recently, and with me today is our producer, Zach Altman.
Good morning.
And Avery Schaller, a science and research coordinator at Western Landowners Alliance.
Hello, it's great to be here.
It's great to have you. So what's the big to-do? Why suddenly wolves in California?
Yeah, so it's a pretty big deal because at the end of October, California Department of Fish and Wildlife actually lethally controlled 4 wolves from the Bam-Sao pack, and it's the first wolves to be lethally controlled in California in a really, really long time.
And so recently there was an article in the New York Times by Arthur Middleton.
I'm a professor of wildlife management here at UC Berkeley.
And so as it relates to that, I know that you have worked with him in some capacity. Can you share some of your background there and tie in how it relates to this new article that's come out?
So Arthur was my PhD advisor at UC Berkeley. Even though I went to UC Berkeley, all my research was based in Northwest Wyoming, outside of Cody, just east of Yellowstone. And my research was focused on wolf-livestock conflict, specifically looking at elk and wolf interactions, movement and predation patterns. And then I also did some social science research where I interviewed ranchers and wildlife managers about the barriers to mitigating wolf-livestock conflict.
Okay, and where are you located right now?
I'm in Corvallis, Oregon now,
Okay.
Yeah, and I work for Western Landowners Alliance.
And are you still working with wolves in that capacity?
I am, yeah. I get to work on wolf-livestock conflict in Eastern Oregon and also across many Western states, just trying to support producers and also getting to work on some research stuff. And yeah, I'm actually about to drive down to Northern California like an hour after this for some wolf meetings. Yeah.
So Avery, I want to back up a little bit to this news story, this op-ed that came out a few weeks ago. Why were 4 wolves lethally removed? What were the circumstances that led to this?
Okay, yeah, I could provide some more background there. This was after about a 7-month period from late March to mid-October, where I think 87 cattle were killed by wolves from a single pack.
Wow.
And a lot of people are calling that unprecedented, not because like these wolves are particularly like vicious killers or something, but more that this just hasn't really happened in other Western states because agencies haven't let it get to that point. And I say that, but CDFW, California Department of Fish and Wildlife, put a lot of effort into having a strike team where they were using lots of non-lethal deterrents. They had wildlife services operating drones. They were using beanbags. They even brought in roadkill to try to feed them something else. They were really taking all measures, and they had people available 24/7. I think they estimated that like 100,000 something hours went into this, like staff hours. So there was a big effort to try to stop these conflicts, but it just kept happening.
That's some important nuance that is often overlooked. Clearly, lethal removal wasn't the first option.
Yes. They tried lots of other things, and it was a last resort. It's tricky in those situations because lethal removal is an important tool, and it's something that we mention at Western Landowners Alliance, 4 Cs. It's compensation, conflict prevention, lethal control, collaboration. It's an important part of it. It's a tool in the toolbox. But when you're in a state like California, where for a while it was not on the table, it puts a lot of the burden on producers because they're the ones experiencing the losses.
And are wolves a new story in California? I mean, I haven't really thought about wolves being in California that much as a general person. Through WLA, I do know that, I was out there in 2021 and at a low stress livestock handling workshop talking about wolves with producers up in the northern part of the state. But how long have we had wolves in California since they've returned?
So the first official confirmed wolf sighting in California in recent history was in 2011 when OR7 came in from Northeast Oregon. He was a dispersing wolf, and he was kind of in and out of California and Southern Oregon. But the first established pack was in 2015 with the Shasta pack. And now I think there's about 10 wolf packs. And I think the latest count at the end of 2024 was about 70 wolves. So there's a decent amount of wolves in California, and mostly in Northern California, but there is a pack down in Sequoia National Park area too.
And have all of these wolves essentially come in naturally?
Yeah, well, it depends on who you ask, I guess. So it's all natural recolonization wolves that have come in from Northeast Oregon. And then the wolves that came to Northeast Oregon in 2008 were all wolves that kind of dispersed from the wolves that were reintroduced to central Idaho in the 90s. So technically all, yes, natural recolonization, but I guess it depends on where you pick the starting point.
Well, Avery, you were able to chat with Arthur about this op-ed about the reality of living with wolves. Let's dive into that interview.
You've been ramping up some work in California through the California Wolf Project, and I was wondering if you could just briefly describe kind of what's happening with wolves in California right now and kind of why this situation feels different from what's happening in other Western states.
We started, I guess almost 2 years ago, ramping up some work on California wolves. And that really was coincident with the growth of the populations. This state has estimated about 10 packs in the state. And so we're kind of at the foot of that more rapid growth curve that we've seen for wolves around the West as they arrive and start to do their thing. As their numbers have started to grow and expand with more pups and yearlings and dispersers and packs inhabiting new areas, that has brought more interactions with people and livestock and predation on livestock along with it. So it's been really exciting for a lot of folks in California to have wolves back in the state after something like a century absent. But of course, for some folks, particularly those whose livestock have been affected, not as exciting by any means.
One of the reasons we wanted to talk to you now about this is you and your Berkeley colleagues with the California Wolf Project, Justin Verschares and Kagi Orrick, recently wrote an opinion piece for the New York Times, and it was widely distributed because it was in the morning briefing, which has like 17 million subscribers or something. And I know a lot of us had people send it to us, so it had a wide reach. And you wrote about the wolf situation in California. And I was just curious what inspired y'all to write this.
Yeah, wow. I didn't know it was that widely distributed, so that's news to me. In fact, I don't even know what the morning briefing is. The motivation, we had been thinking for a while about something that we wanted to say within California, which was essentially that we're not resourcing and embracing and investing in some of the known solutions at the level that is going to be required in order to better protect livestock and maybe restore some of the native prey and reduce conflict over time. And so it just started to feel like an opportunity to try and offer something, forward looking and something constructive about the need to kind of embrace some different kinds of solutions nationally and at the state level.
Yeah, this key message that we need to support the people who share the landscape with large carnivores is really important. And I know that you've been part of several efforts to provide that kind of support in other places besides California. And I was wondering if you could talk about what that looks like on the ground.
Well, I think, a key part of the argument that we made, backing up to kind of the 50 or 100,000 foot level, is that we owe a lot of the recovery of large predators, including and particularly wolves that we've seen in the last several decades, to things like parks and wilderness areas and public lands protections and endangered species laws and hunting, regulations that were put in place by past generations, and that have enabled these species to sort of have a foothold and to expand across many areas of the West. But that those tools aren't going to go the distance. They're not going to take us very far into the future, and that there's a different set of things we need to do. And so that kind of starts with a lot of what we've done in the past is about keeping people away from nature. And now it's we kind of need to view people less as a threat and more as part of the solution. So how do we really begin to be much more serious about developing the relationships on the ground with people that are living alongside these predators? I mean, that's the thing, is we are now living with wolves. It's not wolves are over there and people are over here. People are now being asked to live right there alongside these animals in more and more areas of the West. And so people who care about those predators and who care about their future need to be in a relationship with those communities and asking how they can help. There needs to be a certain level of patience and listening, because this is going to take years, not overnight. So cultivate relationships, listen to folks, and try to put together a set of solutions that's locally feasible and grounded. I think the work WLA and others, we did some of it when I was at USDA for a time, was, to look at how to invest in some of those boots on the ground solutions, whether it be electric fencing and range riding and livestock carcass removal and gradual changes in husbandry or, grazing, calving practices, innovative kinds of deterrence or monitoring and information sharing systems that can help people know when wolves are posing a threat and react to it. There's a range of solutions out there, but we have to do the work to pull the right combinations of those down and adapt them to these landscapes and be willing to invest in those and cost share those. And if it doesn't work, we got to be willing to bring lethal tools back into the picture. Got to have good compensation on the table, because folks need to be encouraged and supported in taking the risk, taking a leap of faith to try some of these new solutions, by being told, let's try some things. And if it doesn't work, there's a backstop, there's some support.
I really like the framing of, people are now part of the solution. Something I've always admired about the work you do is that you've been very intentional about bringing kind of a wide range of people together, whether that's ranchers and landowners and scientists, agencies, NGOs, policymakers. Why is that kind of collaboration so important for working through something as complex as wolf livestock conflict or any conflict with wildlife?
I mean, some of it's personal. It's just I'm not smart enough to know even a tiny fraction of what's, needed. And so if I'm not, then maybe that means, other people also have a slice of the answer, but are lacking other parts of it. If we were thoughtful about making an educated guess about what kinds of people might have parts of the answer and getting them all together to figure this out, then maybe we would have almost the whole answer. I think for me, it starts from a humility of no individual, no single organization is going to have this whole thing. You can also come at it from just these animals that we're talking about, in the case of wolves or a Western ranching operation. These take up a lot of space. These require a large area to thrive. And so anytime we're talking about a large landscape in the Western United States or almost anywhere, there's a bunch of people that are maybe own or manage part of that or have some stake in that. And so that's another angle from which it's okay, we probably need a crew here to be able to do something meaningful.
In your op-ed, you highlight a lot of efforts across the West of ranchers and others who are finding ways to adapt to living with wolves and other large carnivores. Yeah, I feel like the public often assumes that they're unwilling to adapt, and I feel like this misconception can make it harder to build support for policies and for funding to help these communities. Do you have any insights into like how do we change that narrative and
Yeah.
highlight what ranchers are doing to try to make it work?
Yeah, Avery, I think that's one of the most important issues at play here and one of the hardest things to do. And I've been thinking a lot about it because all you have to do is read the comments section in a New York Times op-ed to sort of get a sense of where people are at. Not that I think that that's representative of a broader public, but it gets a person thinking. And so I think there is this huge gap between what the most of the public, particularly urban public, thinks is going on and thinks is how this is going to work and sort of the reality. And I think part of that gap is because there just aren't many venues anymore for people to sort of share and learn about this information. People are more separated, into these different landscapes and corners. And so how do you even educate, a broader public? I think a second thing is time. I've been thinking a lot about time. There's a sense, even in the members of the public that do have a sense of the solutions, there's a lack of an understanding that these might take time to implement. That predators and people adapting to one another isn't something that happens in a month or a year, but is something that happens over many years, decades. I mean, that's not to say there aren't things that can be accomplished quickly, but some of the most important things might take a lot of time. And I think that's a huge issue because I think it really, when people fail to understand that, they can accuse ranchers or folks out on the landscape of not taking action when they really are, but they're just thinking and talking on different timescales. A third thing I've noticed a lot, and Avery, I think you saw it in some of your research, is that the words many people in an urban setting or in an environmental nonprofit or in an agency use to talk about their hopes and expectations of the ranching community, for non-lethal tools, for particular, practices aren't the same words or ideas or understandings that the ranching committee has. So they're sort of can sometimes talk past each other.
Avery, could you jump in here and fill us in on some of your research in this space?
Yeah, so what Arthur was alluding to with my research about the language people use and talking past each other, I came in with my social science research where I was kind of investigating the barriers to mitigating wolf livestock conflict and looking at barriers that impact ranchers' willingness to use non-lethal tools. And in my research, I found that actually I was wrong in my assumptions. Like they were not only willing to use non-lethal tools, but had been trying many different adaptations to sharing the landscape with carnivores. And I just came in with those research questions because that was what's in the literature currently. And that's how I decided to frame my research. But ranchers in the study area where I worked, in the Cody area, they aren't going to let wolves kill their cattle without doing anything. They're really creative. They've tried many different things. They've tried many of the non-lethal tools that people know about, like flagery and fox lights and having a carcass management program. Something that stood out to me was nobody uses the term range riding, which is a term that, I mean, we at WLA use and a lot of nonprofits and people in the coexistence space use. But I found that pretty much everybody was doing range riding. They were just calling it something different, checking cows, like hazing predators. The idea of like calling something a non-lethal tool when it's like actually just an adaptation, like changing their calving season or moving cows out of an area where there was a wolf den. Just that talking past each other, I think the effort that ranchers are putting in is just going unrecognized.
Yeah, that brings up a good point, is that people may often think there wasn't something being done because there may not be this specific buzzword terminology, but they're already doing it. They just consider it part of their job, right? They're just considering it
Yes.
like being a rancher or cowboying or cowgirling. Is that's part of their job, is to be on the landscape, to be checking on their animals, to be adaptively managing based on the information that's coming in of what they're doing. And they're just not labeling it a certain term. But it doesn't mean that things aren't already being done and there's not already boots on the ground trying to mitigate these issues.
Yeah, and that literal use of different language. We, with the Conflict Reduction Consortium, have this messaging guide about talking across the urban-rural divide. Even the exact words that we use can sometimes be divisive. Buzzwords have a tendency to be politicized. I mean, an example of that would be the term coexistence itself.
Oh, yeah.
To a lot of urban folks, that's great. That's what we're going for. And by definition, perhaps so. But for a lot of rural audiences who are living with predators, that term may sound too harmonious for what the reality actually looks like, and maybe feels like sometimes wildlife's needs are put above their human needs and the needs of their livestock. And so saying living and working with wildlife, a lot more words there, but can be a little less inflammatory in some cases.
Yeah, for sure. I definitely don't use the word coexistence in my work, and am very aware that it can have these connotations that don't reflect people's realities.
Great. Well, let's jump back in with your conversation with Arthur Middleton. Avery, your closing question really piqued my interest here.
You've spent quite some time now studying and working on wildlife conflict, and it's a topic that can often feel really heavy. What gives you hope right now?
Well, it is pretty heavy. On this stretch, looking closely at the challenges in Northeastern California has been heavy. But I try to remember that there's a lot to be proud of in this country in terms of the accomplishments of the past century, in terms of large carnivore recovery, the accomplishments of the past several decades, from the reintroduction of wolves and the recovery of grizzly bears from very low numbers over the same time period, and many others we could point to. Generally, there's been progress. I also think there's been like the things I wrote in the Times op-ed about the solutions that are being tested and developed. 10 years ago, 15 years ago, I couldn't have written those words. I couldn't have named the things. There wasn't that much to point to. There was more of a sense of that this was kind of a hopeless conflict. When things are heavy, I try to remember the incremental and sometimes major, bouts of progress that I've seen over the last decade of my own career.
Let's say for folks who haven't read it yet, what really stood out to you the most from Arthur's piece?
I think it was a really important piece to get out there because a lot of people don't have context for wolf and livestock conflict and don't really think that much about the people who are affected. What stood out to me in this article was this call to support the people who are adapting to living with wolves and are trying different things. And it's just something that is really difficult to do alone with your own resources. And so this call to get more funding, get more resources on the ground, support the people who are adapting and ranching with wolves on the landscape.
Yeah, it feels like a huge get for us in this like more nuanced working wild conflict reduction space. I mean, the morning newsletter from the New York Times reaches 17 million people, and it was featured in that. Our Range Rider Toolkit on the WLA website that was authored by Jared Beaver and a bunch of other partners, including WLA, was hyperlinked there. So, I mean, people are getting exposed to some of these other options, and it's just a cool thing to see on the national stage.
I was looking back on the little snippet that they have in the morning newsletter, and it's conservationists have spent too much time protecting animals and not enough supporting their coexistence with people. And a lot of early conservation was spent on like protected areas and getting these populations up. And now we're like, oh, we've had a lot of conservation successes, and there's a lot more overlap of wildlife and people, and we got to support those people who are supporting the habitat that these wildlife live in. And it's just cool to see how some of this has changed.
Speaking to that, Arthur tries to illustrate that while a lot of the reintroduction works and stuff take place on federally protected lands, it's really these working landscapes that these animals generally find themselves on and are so vital to ensuring the connectivity piece that these animals need. Do you feel his framing around wolves and working lands felt accurate to what you see on the ground? Or was there something missing there that, these op-ed pieces are so short that you feel like you'd like listeners to maybe hear?
Yeah, that's a good question. I mean, I think he covered it pretty well. And I think a lot of people don't realize that most wolves, I mean, for sure in the Western US, live outside of protected areas. I think there's maybe like 3,000 something wolves in the Western US. And I don't know, Yellowstone has what, like 200 something wolves. I think when people picture wolves, they just picture Yellowstone and these areas that they think of as wilderness, wild places, but wolves they're in some country where there's a lot more people than you realize. I think a lot of people don't think of working landscapes as wildlife habitat, but I've spent a lot of field work, both I also my PhD research, I was investigating wolf kills, so following wolves around and seeing where they were going. For a lot of it, we were on ranches and grazing allotments, and I just remember having moments of like, this is more beautiful than Yellowstone. Like, this is an incredible place, and like, no wonder wolves and grizzlies and elk and a ton of wildlife are here. I wish people could see this version of the ranch that like I know and that I get to see.
I agree.
The takeaway for me, and I'm curious to hear what you guys think, is our mindset around conservation needs to change. The real front line today is these working landscapes where there's people there. And so the solutions are going to look different. Something came up for me in Arthur's interview, just the sense of, keeping a bird's eye view of how far we've come with this work and a sense of hope. And I think he speaks to it well.
Another thing that gives me some optimism is just like getting out on the landscape and interacting with people who I might read in a news article being characterized as, just angry or impeding progress or something. But then I'm out there talking to them on their ranch and they say, hey, look, we can figure this out. It's just like we need some help and it's going to take a long time and we can't just put up with any level of livestock loss. And so I get some encouragement from just actually getting out and listening to what people actually say than just kind of reading it in the news or whatever, because it's always more encouraging, in person, out on the ground in a real conversation.
I feel like that's the spirit of what Working Wild University is all about, which it's nice to hear from Arthur.
Yeah, I was just going to say, season 1 of Working Wild U, when we tackled wolves in the West, we kept using this term, radical center. There's a lot of loud noises on either end of the spectrum, and yet there's this quiet radical center. And the whole approach that we did, we looked at Montana and Wyoming and Oregon and different places, and the things that were common in those areas as we dug in, and it was predominantly that we are pushing the needle a little bit. As Arthur said, though, that's a slow process.
Yeah, I mean, in my work, I found that, the best messengers are from rancher to rancher. At WLA co-hosted some range riding workshops with Ray Nickerson, and we brought in people from Montana and Washington who had been doing range riding to places like Oregon and Colorado and Arizona, where it was a little newer. And I think just being able to hear from people who've dealt with the reality of like having this new challenge brought to them and having to figure out ways to make it work, and getting like the honest truth of like, maybe this didn't work perfectly the first time we tried it, but we found ways to make it work to our specific setting. I think opportunities like that to get people connected and hear from each other are really, really helpful. And I think that last part he was talking about, like when you go and actually talk to people and they're just like, we want to try these things, but just need a little bit of support. It takes a lot to try something new on your operation. Like, you have to adjust a lot of different things, and being able to take that risk is kind of a luxury. If you don't really know it's going to work the first time and you invest all these resources and labor in it, and you try it and it doesn't work, doesn't mean that they're not going to try it again. It just means like it's just that much more resources that are going to go into trying to find something else that doesn't work. And I think like a lot of people don't have the luxury to take on additional risk when ranching is already such a risky livelihood. And so being able to provide people the support to kind of take those risks and not have it be their downfall, I think is what WLA and others are trying to do.
That's the really nuanced portion of it is that even with cost share programs and things like that, like they take the time to sign up, and it's not 100% totally paid for. There's going to be processes within their own operation that have to change, and additional pockets out of cost. And there's not a silver bullet. You're not going to perfectly prevent conflict from ever occurring. How do we provide enough support from a general public standpoint that make these on that risk assessment less of a stressful component for them, to make it easier for us to implement some of that? And that's kind of the real question, but I feel like that's advancement in the conversation.
I think that's a great point to end on. Avery, thank you so much for joining us today, and thanks for this conversation, and also hopping in and interviewing Arthur, your old PhD advisor, for us.
Yeah, it was a lot of fun.
Working Wild U is a production of Western Landowners Alliance and Montana State University Extension. This episode was hosted by Jared Beaver and produced by me, Zach Altman, with support from Avery Schaller and Lewis Wirtz. Thanks again to Arthur Middleton for joining us today. You can find a link to Arthur's New York Times op-ed and all the publications and resources we mentioned over in the show notes, and you can head to workingwild.us to find those. If you enjoyed this episode, please go ahead and leave us a review wherever you're listening, and be sure to give us a follow on Instagram. Thanks. We'll see you next time.